When is a blockchain valuable? This is one of the critical questions that any company or startup purporting to use blockchain technologies has to be able to answer. And for some startups who think they are doing so, the answer may be for their application, no. And that's just fine. There may be other benefits to that application. But for other startups, blockchain technology may be the thing that is facilitating their entire venture. So how can we tell? Let me play this video from Seinfeld that sort of illustrates the nature of the problem for blockchain.
Hello, Newman.
Come on, let's go. I got the helmet. Go get the radar detector.
Okay, all right. I'll be back in a sec. Hey, you guys coming to my party? Yeah.
Sure.
What's this all about?
We're making a trade. I'm giving him my motorcycle helmet. He's giving me his radar detector.
I didn't know you have a motorcycle.
Well, my girlfriend had one.
You have a girlfriend?
I had a girlfriend, and she was pretty wild.
I remember you with a girl.
Nevertheless.
This is a pretty bad deal for Kramer. You know, a radar detector's worth much more than that helmet. I think you're cheating him.
Don't say anything.
All right. Hey, you know you're getting gypped over here. Really? Huh?
Hey, we had a deal. Are you reneging out of the deal? Are you reneging? That's a renege.
Oh, stop saying reneging.
Well, you're reneging.
Okay, I'm not reneging.
All right, give it to me. All right, let go.
Well, go on three. Give me that. Just give me that. Break it. Here, idiots.
Thanks, buddy. So long.
Does that thing work? Nah.
So you can see in that problem, there are two issues with transacting. One is solved by Jerry, which is basically the simultaneity problem. They want to exchange the helmet and the radar detector simultaneously because they don't trust each other. The second part is, of course, that the radar detector doesn't work at all. Now, the question is, which one of these situations can blockchain solve? Can blockchain substitute for Jerry? Can it come in and solve the problem Newman is going to face with bad goods? Or could it solve both? Those are the open questions. So, at the heart of it is trust. We've heard this before with blockchain technologies. What is trust? What is the trust that we're looking for? Basically, trust arises when an agent can be reasonably certain an obligation will be met. When you don't have trust, what do? You can engage in simultaneous exchange. That was effectively what happened in the Seinfeld video. But if you can't do that, and that you have to have some sort of transaction where one obligation is met well before another obligation, then you need sort of mechanisms to sort of replicate the simultaneity that occurs. And provide that trust assurance. One such mechanism is to find, of course, trustworthy people. The big issue, of course, for most is how do you know if they're trustworthy or not? Sometimes you know, sometimes you don't know. That can be limiting. The second is to rely on relationships. If you deal with someone repeatedly, you can end up trusting them because you know there's a mutual benefit from not reneging that might otherwise occur. When you're outside of a relationship, you can rely on third parties. This is what contract law does. It allows you to write contracts and then have a third party step in with the force of law to enforce the obligations that were made in the contract. The big issue there is that third party and that enforcement mechanism easily accessible to people? If it's very costly, contract law is not going to help. Finally, you can rely on reputation. So it's a bit like a relationship, but a reputation is where you can see other people's dealings with a person and therefore work out whether you can rely on them or trust them in some degree. And it'll be in their self-interest to actually meet obligations. Why? Because otherwise their reputation would fall and they'll lose opportunities for trade. So to give meaning to obligations, we effectively need to solve the timing issue. And I think this is where the heart of where blockchain may turn out to be very useful. What is the fundamental unit of analysis that any venture should be looking at in order to understand whether blockchain is going to be useful for them? Some people have harped on transactions, but I think actually obligations are the right focus. An obligation is a specific action by an agent. Okay, it's something that somebody will do. Obligations are created if a specific state arises. For instance, someone gives you money, you may have an obligation then to provide them with goods or services that they were expecting. So that's a specific state. Sometimes an obligation arises because something outside in the world has occurred. So obligations are created if this specific state arises. In other words, obligations don't just exist. There's something triggers them. So this state may be an event, may be an outcome, or it may be the performance of another obligation, which is, of course, the interesting case we want to look at here. So in order to create an obligation, states must be recorded. It's not going to create an obligation if you don't think the state has arisen. If you can't tell, can't see it, you don't trust that it's occurred, or what have you. You don't know if you've got a payment, for instance. So these states have to be recorded. Also, to make obligations really work and be relied upon, when they're performed, that performance must be verified. That must be known to the parties that it's been performed, and also potentially in a way outside of the relationship as well, if you are relying on some external enforcement mechanism. Let me give you an example of how this might arise in the context of what we'll broadly call international trade. One of the problems that people who buy things from overseas, say answering an Instagram or a Facebook ad, is that you don't always get delivered what you expected. And here's some examples of that. This is a well-known problem. The issue that arises here is, while if you transacted in a local store, you can go down, complain to the store, complain to some local authority. With international trade, that becomes much, much harder. You might be able to get a credit card company to have some recourse and other things like that, if that's possible. But in other situations, well, you're just stuck with whatever you get. And so it's a fear of things like this that cause people to avoid international trade altogether. So what can we do to improve this? Well, there's sort of four things that need to happen. You have an obligation, a set of obligations in international trade. They're created by various events. You need to record the fact that those events have arisen, and then you need to verify that the obligation has actually been performed. So the traditional way in the international trade example would be, say, the obligation is for a customer to pay someone. It's created as soon as you order something. You record it by sending somebody money, and you verify that it has occurred by being able to produce a bank statement or something similar. Another obligation is delivery. If you've ordered something, you've paid for it, the payment triggers somebody to send that order to you. We've received a payment, we will now deliver it to you. When it's delivered, you send a message, it's been delivered, and you can verify that delivery, both ends in this case, say by a carrier receipt if you've used some sort of registered mail or delivery service. And then the final obligation, which is the heart of the issues that we were just talking about, is of course quality. The delivery triggers a mechanism to open it up and see, have I got the right quality? Yes, I send a message, yes, I did, or no, I didn't. And my verification of this in the traditional way would be to go to a court or a third party to complain if the quality wasn't what I was promised. Well, how does this change when we move to a blockchain type situation? Now watch carefully. See it? We go back. Not a lot. Not a lot. Basically, with regard to payments, you don't need a statement. You can have a key that you can check that somebody has actually sent a payment to you. And for quality, you would have to come up with some sort of mechanism to make it work. Quality doesn't reside easily on the blockchain, so you have to develop something there. Notice for delivery, the blockchain doesn't help at all, but nor do we need it. if we're going to carry a receipt, we've got all the ingredients we need to ensure that that particular obligation works. So in other words, if a blockchain is going to help international trade, it's going to be because it's going to help verification of payments and also somehow verification of quality. So recall that what triggers an obligation is a state. A state arises that gives rise to an obligation that's created, which in turn gets performed. And what's interesting, of course, is rarely are obligations just sitting there on their own. They're two-way. The performance of the obligation sets in state a new state which gives rise to further obligations. And so there's an interdependency between all of them in some sort of relationship. So the state has to be observed, the obligation has to be clear to parties when it occurs, and performance has to be verified some way. If you don't have all these things, you can't get obligations working in the way that we want them to work. Now, the way we traditionally deal with a state, assuring that, is we account for it. We account for that state. We find some way of measuring it. An obligation is clear because we've sort of encoded it in, say, a document or an understanding somehow, maybe some sort of communication. And performance works because it's a commitment. We have some sort of commitment to being able to verify, look at a review process, something like that, or a procedure that will allow us to commit to performing that obligation. In today's world, these are performed by various job functions in a lot of industries. Otherwise, we wouldn't really have an economy. We have accountants and auditors to observe the state and measure it for us. We have lawyers to tell us what's clear about obligations and ensure they're coded the right way. And then we have judges or some other third party to work out that we've actually performed our obligations so that this is all a binding commitment. When it comes to the blockchain, we want to do things differently. There are three elements to the blockchain that correspond to these three elements here. The first gets all the attention, which is the distributed ledger that gives rise to an accounting mechanism where you can record the state of the world. That's effectively what a blockchain does. The second is a virtual machine that in some blockchains, notably Ethereum and its offshoots, actually have, that allows you to encode, also as part of the blockchain itself, various programs and triggers that trigger off states. And then finally, with regard to performance, we usually measure performance by the transfer of a token from one party to another. That's not just for payment, that's for any sort of performance, is basically a reassignment of an obligation from not being done to done in a ledger. And the parties can see that transfer take place. The benefits of the ledger in a blockchain is better security. Rather than being so centralized, or you could bribe an auditor, or auditors just bad, ledgers sort of record this information and it's very hard to disrupt them. Once they're recorded in these blocks, it's hard to go back and change them. That gives rise to security. For a virtual machine, the advantages of having a virtual machine in a ledger, you don't actually need that. You could run a ledger and have some code base held on an app somewhere and just run code to do various things. But the advantage of having it part of the ledger and the code base is you can have interoperability, interdependency. And so different obligations running off different codes and maybe between different parties and different relationships can all work with one another. And then finally, the purpose of a token and the idea of performed obligations is to provide incentives. You basically want to boost up someone's reward for performing an obligation and punish them if they haven't. That's the sort of thing you want to encode there. And tokens are a way of doing that, not just through money, but through just the recording of whatever they represent. It may be, for instance, reputational. So a trust problem is at the heart of all of this. You have to, in order to think that this was going to be a worthwhile so the blockchain is going to help you where you've got some trust issues with traditional methods. So what is a trust problem? A trust problem is there some problem observing the state? Are the obligations unclear? And is there a problem tying the return to performance? Those are the three ingredients of a trust problem. Fail on any one of these and you're going to have trouble generating trust or generating the outcomes you want from trust. But the interesting one that I want to focus on here is incentives. because that was the thing at the heart of where it wasn't very obvious how a blockchain would solve the Seinfeld problem or the international trade problem. So with regard to incentives, you sometimes want to tie the performance to reward and create simultaneity. For instance, escrow is a good way of doing that. You sort of park the payments and you have it triggered by the performance of other obligations, even if the payment occurred way in advance of those other obligations, and vice versa. You can account for performance to create reputation for trustworthiness, and so come up with a score. And a score is what you earn by continued performance, and that gives you reputational incentives. And if you record all that on a ledger, you get a lot of security for that. The big problem with reputations is people might steal it or manipulate it in some way. And you could possibly create a mechanism that allows for verified performance recording, some sort of trading mechanism. Now, I don't have time to go into that. Those are the things that come out from a mechanism or a market design course. But they are possible and they do exist, and people have been exploring how they might generate solutions to the problems of international trade that we just went through. But without going into those details, how would you actually take your own venture and understand when a blockchain is going to be useful? Well, here's a simple canvas you can use. It asks you a set of questions. First, try to list the obligations that you are going to require as part of your venture. What are the payments? To whom? What are the performance things that have to be undertaken, the tasks, etc.? What are they? Just list them. For each obligation, then explain why there is a trust problem. Recall that a trust problem arises when either the state is imprecise, the obligations are unclear, or there is an issue of verifying performance. What's happening in the real world? What are the risks associated with trust for these obligations? The third question is, why don't traditional methods actually solve the trust problem? So imagine you don't have a blockchain. What would occur? If your answer is, oh, they can, well, you got to understand, well, what am I going to get from a blockchain? But it's going to help you if you can identify precisely where traditional methods start to fall down for each obligation. And finally, you ask yourself questions about what a blockchain can do, and that's the three parts of the blockchain. Where can a ledger actually add security? Where can a virtual machine add interdependency? Is there some reason for that? That would be useful. And where can a token be used to align incentives in the way that we talked about in the previous slide? It may well be that for many obligations, the answer is nowhere for the blockchain. But you may have a venture where some critical obligation that's critical to the whole thing working is going to require a blockchain or one element of a blockchain. If that's the case, there's a value for the blockchain in your company and you can use it.